Hello and welcome. This event is part of Festival of Ideas Online, a series of conversations with writers and thinkers from all over the world. You can watch more from the series at the Bristol Ideas YouTube channel and head to bristolideas.co.uk for even more video, audio and essays. My name is Zoe Stedman-Milne and I'm the creative content producer at Bristol Ideas. Today, I am joined by the poet Solmaz Sharif to talk about her collection, Customs, her first to be published in the UK. Welcome, Solmaz.
Thank you, Zoe. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So a very brief introduction.
Yeah.
Here in the world. Very brief introduction for our viewers. You were born in Istanbul to Iranian parents in the early 1980s, but were raised in the US, moving between Texas, Alabama, and California as a child. And you're currently the Shirley Schenker Assistant Professor in English at UC Berkeley. Your first poetry collection, Look, which unfortunately is not available in the UK, but was a finalist for the 2016 National Book Awards. And interestingly, and again, I'm hoping this will be published in the UK so we can read it, because it apparently uses vocabulary from the US Department of Defense dictionary to interrogate the language of warfare. So Customs was published in the US last year to great acclaim. So the New York Times, for example, called it witty and incisive and added that you were masterfully traversing the landscapes of exile and all its complicated grief. And the collection was published here in the UK earlier this spring, and of course is available in all good bookshops, and I urge you to go and purchase yourself a copy. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really delighted. And of course, it's that interesting sort of transatlantic experience where I think it's morning where you are and sort of later in the day. I think one of the most interesting things about poetry from around the world is, especially when it's English-speaking poetry, and sort of the differences. So how do you feel being described, I suppose, to a certain extent, as an American poet to this new British audience?
That's a great question. It's one I haven't been asked before and one I haven't really considered, but at the risk of cliche, the only time I feel American is really when I'm outside of the US. And within that kind of a more global context, it becomes obvious all the ways that I'm so-called American. And I don't know how I feel about it, only that I guess I feel how I feel about any of the kinds of, nouns or adjectives that are used to describe my life and my position, which is a kind of a mix of, bemusement and frustration and resentment and like resignation, yeah, but I haven't given it much thought yet in this context, so it's a first.
Well, should we start first with the title of the collection? I think I've sort of read somewhere that I think someone had described customs as a very politically charged word, but I would sort of argue that it's always been a sort of politically charged word, especially in let's face it, sort of empire countries such as the US and such as Britain. So do you want to talk a little bit about the meanings for you that you wanted to impart on us, the reader, by choosing the title Customs?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with you that it's always been a politically charged word, and it is a politically charged word outside of the realm of quote unquote politics. And by politics, I mean, the realm of the state expressly, or empire. Customs are always about power, even if they are just the traditions of a kind of belonging that one hands down over generations. Traditions and customs which are lost, obviously, upon immigration, or whether they are the kinds of customs of the literary establishment in the US in particular, or the literary establishment in the English language writ large, which were also things that I wanted to kind of explore and name more directly in this collection, as my first book, Look, had come out and was, as you said, about or dealt with the US Department of Defense's dictionary of military and associated terms. And I was on tour for that book, and I was already thinking towards, physical kinds of customs that one passes, literal borders that one crosses. And I was confronting the kinds of borders of the literary establishment and all the quiet customs that are imposed upon young writers in order to prove themselves perhaps, right? And ultimately, when taken without any kind of criticality, allow for a culture that becomes a tool of empire. Not just allow for, but create, perhaps even actively create culture as a tool of empire. And so what is the poet's role against empire in that sense? So I wanted that to be in the background, and it became more and more part of the foreground of the book as I worked on it, and as I was traveling for the first collection, and as I was kind of coming up against the limitations of thinking of politics as something that happens solely within these theaters of war and everything else.
Lovely. Well, I think this is probably a good time to hear one of the poems, and you're very kindly going to read. Do you want to introduce the poem? Do you want to say a little bit about it before we go to the reading?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm going to read a poem, Visa, and so much of my first collection was called Look. So much of my writing practice is about looking and image and visuality, yes, but also really about the quality of attention that's brought to the looking, and exploring what pressures have determined my quality of attention and what sorts of political possibilities there might be in that quality of attention as well. So this is a poem, I think, that really just gets right to that and the central themes of the book. So I thought it would be a good place for us to kind of start.
Right.
Visa. From past participle of videre or to see. The site decided by officer. The officer deciding by blood sugar, last blowjob received, and relative level of disdain for vermin. Domestic terminals do not have this railing at the exit. As we wait for her to exit customs, our sight line is obstructed by opaque sliding doors, the twisting hallway behind it, the small convex mirror hung in the corner in which we catch shapes growing larger into hair color, into gait, into age, and finally as they turn into kin. The hours I've stood there behind that railing. The hours I've stood to savor the seconds earlier, seconds more by which my eye may reach the disembarking and exclaim, she's here, watch from shadow to shape to gate, my imagined life come to life and approach briefly me. My imagined life crying hot in my ear, ink on its finger pads. This will be the last I write of it directly, I say each time. This is a light that lights everything and dimly. All my waiting is at this railing. All my writing is this squint.
Thank you very much for that. I think one of the big things about this collection for me was thinking about the political and sort of the idea of the poet as a political being. And I suppose, and I think this is probably something that you were probably asked a lot last year when you were talking to American journalists about the collection, and whether or not, this collection could be viewed as a form of writing therapy for yourself and for maybe the reader. But I wonder whether, I don't know, could you talk a little bit about maybe the sort of the poet's role in balancing trying to awaken empathy in the reader, but as opposed to maybe trying to inspire action? I suppose I'm quite interested in the tension between, yes, empathy and action.
I don't think there's a relationship between empathy and action. Or the relationship between empathy and action is more often a relationship of inaction. Because empathy to me is such a kind of contained experience. One steps into the life of the other, one imagines oneself in the shoes of the other, and then one, takes those shoes off and goes on with one's life. And it's it's pretty telling to me that, you know, we have, for example, President Obama and Marilyn Robinson discussing the possibilities and significance of empathy, you know, as a kind of civic duty, and as really useful citizenship. I think that's that conversation is pretty emblematic of what the limit of empathy would be, right? Because I think if there were a true empathy, it's hard to justify something like a kill list existing, for example, or something like, you know, unilateral kind of an extrajudicial assassination or aerial bombardment, or, you know. So in other words, empathy is something that can lubricate American empire. You know, empathy is something that is a part of police training. It's a part of training for interrogators, actually. You know, I use empathy when I am trying to get answers out of people, you know. I think, you know, I had this experience when I was teaching an undergraduate workshop where I was using the word empathy, and I stopped and I realized, it's like, why am I using this word empathy? Like, why am I asking for more empathy? What I mean is I actually want to ask for more love, but there's something about love that feels, I'm not supposed to say that in a classroom, you know, and it's not locatable or scientific in the same way. It's certainly far messier, you know. It can lead to, it is the dissolution of like boundary and of, you know, containment and will, you know, self-will, and is, for me, actually the actual location of radical possibility and of radical involvement, and also is ultimately what we owe each other and what we owe ourselves, not empathy. Empathy, I think, is just the necessary thing that keeps us, you know, able to stomach what's happening, you know, and not become kind of overwhelmed by it. But every once in a while, and I do think the poem is the site of that whelming, you know. So what does it mean actually to remind ourselves of what it is that we are trying not only to not to metabolize or sublimate or anything, but are actively looking away from, are actively ignoring, in order to justify the comforts or discomforts of our lives, you know. And what happens when we have active reckoning with that instead, with love as the kind of guidance or background. And I think it's the poem that really becomes the kind of force through which this reckoning can happen.
I think that's something that you achieve quite beautifully throughout the collection, in fact, because I was in equal parts sort of amused at points. I think you're very witty, but you're telling this sort of a very beautiful story, but the individual poems they're all, you know, they are of their own, but at the same time you are kind of weaving this narrative. And again, one of the, this idea of belonging keeps coming back to it, and as a child of sort of immigrants myself, this idea of belonging being quite an elusive thing, and something I think that we can all recognize. I think this idea that maybe struggling to feel at home is a bit of a human, it's sort of a human thing that we can all experience at some point in our life. But I think maybe the sort of the immigrant experience about never feeling quite at home is quite a unique one. And I suppose one of the things that struck me most about your collection is this idea of never belonging to a place that didn't want you to start off with. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and how you wanted to kind of, how you wanted to talk about that in the poems.
I think earlier in my writing, most of what I wanted to do was to talk about that, so to speak, right? So what might it mean to bring the actual material conditions of these stories, my own included, to life? And what does it mean, you know, because I totally agree, Zoe, that there's something about that lack of belonging or a sense of, you know, homelessness and wanting to go home, wanting to return home, that's just an existential spiritual longing that's probably innate in all of us for whatever reason. But then some of us come up against that material reality immediately, right? And are never allowed even the material illusion, you know, of feeling at home. And I just wanted to name the matter of that, right? Who's doing what to whom? What can be done about it? How does that impact people? You know, and the more I did that, the more I found myself actually moving into that, into a space that the proper nouns of this condition seem to matter less and less, you know, and they feel to me just a kind of a brief blip that's a part of a much larger and kind of amorphous existential spiritual lack of belonging, and that this is an avenue through which to move toward that, which is also not to say I am not interested in transcending the material realities that I'm naming. I'm not interested in treating them as allegory or metaphor. You know, they are concrete and real things, and it is, I always believe that it is in like the burrowing into and the naming of the real that we can actually touch that kind of ineffable quality that's actually shimmering beneath everything that it is that we do. And so wanting to name my relationship to Iran, you know, doing a trip home in order to figure out ways of doing that is what really led to me moving away from that, I think, or moving through it. Yeah.
And actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of, so the idea of returning to, I hate sort of using that expression, but the idea of the homeland, so that you go to the homeland, and the stories that have been told generally in your families, in your kind of the circle of your parents' acquaintances. It has kind of creates some sort of form of nostalgia, which I think can never actually be met when you go to the place. And again, that's something I thought was beautifully sort of described in the poems. But again, do you want to, I think it's that idea of nostalgia, which I think again sort of links sort of immigrants to each other, because we all, it's almost like a sort of a fantasy version that we have. And do you want to talk a little bit about, because obviously again, I imagine Iran in, let's say, Texas is probably very different from, let's say, Iran maybe in California. I imagine that has different flavors.
Oh, absolutely. And then the Iran in Texas in the 80s versus the Iran in Texas now. And then the gap, you know, the gaps just kind of widen in a way, you know. And yesterday I was thinking, because I just saw this film by Panahi called No Bears that came out recently. And I was thinking about nostalgia. And I was thinking about how growing up in LA in particular, and LA is such the kind of, I mean, there's something really heartbreaking about the immigrant community and reality there, because Tehrangeles is the butt of the joke ultimately, right? And you have these lives and homes and, you know, palaces, so to speak, that are built and out of this kind of like ingrown and infected nostalgia, you know, where one is still singing the same songs, one is still returning to the same music, one is still thinking not only about the names of the streets as they are now, but the names that they were before the current revolution, you know, and plotting and planning one's return and imagining oneself as central to that return, you know. There was something about that and I grew up in that, and there's that window. I don't know how long it is. Maybe it's about a decade. I think it's probably shorter than a decade. Maybe it's about 5 years, where there is something like return that might be possible, right? But the reality is we only believe return is possible when we believe that the homeland, so to speak, is that static image, is that static object, you know, and it is waiting and receptive to our return, you know, and it is necessarily none of those things, in fact, right? And so when I was a kid and I would go, you know, and I went for the first times, and it's, you know, cousins and language and fun and like being out on streets and just feeling like looking like people and, you know, just kind of feeling a part of, and then returning in your 20s or early 30s, and everybody's, you know, you know, it almost, it's a strange feeling to try to describe, but it felt almost rude for me to be there. I don't think anybody would say that it was, you know, but I don't know how else to quite describe it. I felt like I was rupturing the agreement, you know, particularly when if you're dealing with a country where people can't leave, you know, where the passport is one of the least valued in the world, right? So like, and here I am, and it's like, oh well, I'll come now, and then I get to leave, and good luck to you, like, you know, yeah.
And yes, and I was going to say that is a massive part of the experience, because
Sure.
At the end of the day, one has left, and there were reasons for the leaving, and so the return has got all these meanings attached to it now. And like you say, when there's a return that means, you know, you can still leave but others can't, it kind of, again, it sort of it colors the taste of the place, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, I think there's a bit of an artistic crisis in that, because there is this sense always that one's art and one's work and one's self is really only as good as like the depth of one's presence within a kind of language or community or culture, or, you know. And so what does it mean to be completely unmoored and tasteless in a way, you know, to be like tone deaf to that kind of, you know, not tone deaf, but there's just this way that there is no culture that I seem to quite get, right? So yeah. And that's not a strength, supposedly, right? In our models, yeah.
No, but I think it is that. But again, and sort of again, friends that I've grown up with over the years, I think when you have experienced a lot of a sort of movement, so when you have, for example, moved a lot, you've changed lots of schools, it kind of gives you that opportunity, or I think it teaches you to be a little bit invisible when you need to be. And I wonder whether that fits into this idea of the culture, and not necessarily always having the ear of the culture, but I think it makes us possibly quicker to pick the culture up, because we've always had to kind of be invisible until we're not, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. You don't want to attract attention to how you don't fit in, right? So just like finding the way to kind of disappear a bit into the background, and obviously, and in that context, it makes sense that I would pick this more invisible medium too, you know. And there's something about it there's something about the scope of time and poetry, you know, and the kind of timelessness or out of timeness of the immigrant experience, if there is such a thing, or of displacement that I seem to be really attached to. Well, I'm not of this time, so I'll just write into this future that, you know, where no one is of this time, right? Yeah.
Well, but that also leads me to ask you, because obviously the collection has been out in the US for a while, and obviously you were writing it for a while before that, and now you're revisiting it for the UK audience. So I wonder how much, you know, how do you feel about it now? Because time has passed. Do you still, I don't know if that's probably quite a boring question, but are there bits of it that you think, oh no, I wish I changed that, or could I add to that? Or are there bits that you sort of have actually reworked in your mind? Yes, I suppose that's the question, is how do you feel about it now that time has passed?
I feel it's exactly what it needed to be and should have been, and like any other poem that I've written, I wouldn't write it today, and that's a good thing. And you know, so I try to remain as deeply committed to the time that I find myself in, and the questions of that time. And I see each of the poems in each of the books that I've written and hopefully will write as a part of a lifelong, you know. So the opening of look is it matters what you call a thing. And as I was thinking of the opening line of that book, I was also trying to think of the opening line of a writing life, you know, which is not even to say that I will agree with that statement forever. I don't know if I agree with it today. Right now, I feel so, there's something about devoting oneself to poetry that makes one kind of, I hate language right now. That's actually the reality of it, you know. So it doesn't matter what we call it. Like, you know, the mattering is not in the calling, you know. And yet I've devoted my life to calling. So what does that mean, you know? But just to give myself enough to kind of keep wrestling with, and was it accurate to that wrestling at that time? And the last poem in this collection is a kind of I'm trying to write my way out of older ways of engaging with my work and these questions, and it ends in the middle of a sentence. And so yeah, there's something about this collection that feels like the closing of a door.
Well, that's interesting you said that, because I thought that because of the unendingness of that final sentence, for me, it became a little bit, I don't know, a bit of a loop. I sort of thought about it, and I think that's probably why when I first read it, I actually read it twice straight away, because I almost had to go back to the beginning of it. So I felt it was, I suppose maybe that's it. I did feel it was a complete cycle in its ownness. Which was immensely, from a reader's point of view, immensely pleasing. I think sometimes with poetry collections, I don't know, sometimes, and again, I suppose it's when I've read quite a lot and I've had quite a lot to do with publishers. In the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, okay, so what was the editorial stylistic choice to end at this point? One of the things I thought was very refreshing with yours is that I don't think that was a conversation you had either with an editor or even with yourself. I feel, I don't know if that's probably me sort of.
Wait, which part was it, the conversation? Tell me.
So no, the sort of the last line that you don't
as
finish it. Yes,
yeah.
And I just read it as, oh, and now I just go back to the beginning. That just makes sense to me.
Yeah, that does make sense, and I do think I mean I like that experience too, because it feels like it is a closed loop, you know, and ultimately, like, one of the central tensions of my own obsession and life and practice is trying to find ways of breaking out of, or breaking through, or leaving, or getting away, you know, getting out, getting to the other thing, you know. And then you kind of return and it's actually the same thing, you know, over and over. And certainly that's part of what it is. And so my mind, when I was imagining the ending, I thought of like you know, it flashes to white in my mind, and I don't quite know what's next. But the reality is I may very well, Zoe, find myself right back at the beginning again in this next collection, because it's all there is in the end is a kind of, you know, obsessive central thorn that we return to, whether we, you know, like it or not.
Well, and those feelings don't go away. So that the things, you know, so that idea of, you know, nostalgia and belonging, they're constantly changing, but they won't go away.
Sure.
They're not fixable. It's not something that you can sort of go, and that's all done and dusted.
Yeah, done.
Changing tack very slightly, and this I suppose is a question that's slightly more political, but what do you feel about the state of poetry in the US, I suppose, at the moment? Obviously, you're at a university, you are a poet, you're, you know, what we call a working poet, you're making money from your craft. Do you think the state of poetry is good in America? You know, for probably a lot of our viewers are UK based, they probably don't know how much poetry is taught in schools, that kind of thing. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of, or at least what you think how poetry is faring in the US?
I think it's a terrifically exciting time to be a poet in the US. And I think, I mean, I don't know numbers, but it feels like so many more poets are being published. So much more poetry is being taught and turned to. And it's, when I started writing, or I went to grad school, it was an insult, you know. It was not good writing to write politically, you know. It was lesser, it was minor work, you know, and it was too angry and too didactic, and we'd done that before, and you know, and then with Trump's election in 2016 in particular, I think there was this kind of, then there was a panic in the literary establishment of like, well, how do we, but if fascism comes back, then what do we do, you know? And where are our poets? Like, we do need those poets, so there's been this, you know, increase in interest in turning to and toward that political poetry. And my own particular kind of is it, I don't know, is it hesitation or fear, or I wish in the US, there were more conversation around the intention of poems, and the intention of poetry, and the intention of writing and art making in general. And I know that we have been really taught not to do that, you know, from the new critics on, from before the new critics. But I do think that lack of conversation around intention, and in particular, what it is that we imagine that a poem does in the world, can do in the world, what it is that a poet can do in the world and should do in the world, and what does one as a poet want to do in the world. Without those conversations within the world of this kind of, the inherited world of the inner subjective lyric, you know, there's this danger of this quote unquote political work kind of really chasing its own tail and becoming I'm not thinking of anything in particular, but there's always this danger in American culture in general, or the culture of any empire, of it becoming a narcissistic exercise, really, rather than a exercise of liberation, which I think is possible, and which I think, you know, is certainly being undertaken by more poets than I can name. But it's that particular question and concern that I find myself most attached to, trying to figure out how to articulate for myself and for my students.
No, thank you.
What's your sense of poetry over there? Yeah,
it's interesting you said that. So Bristol is a city. Thomas Chatterton was born in Bristol, and so and the Romantic poets spent time in Bristol. The lyrical ballads, in part, were written and performed in Bristol. So there is that kind of sort of oldie worldy sort of heritage side of it. But actually, sort of the modern scene is actually flourishing, and I would say, despite government's sort of best efforts to sort of rid a lot of arts out of school curriculums, for example, and sort of not putting value into culture. So Bristol has a really great poetry festival. We have a city poet who we've now got our 4th city poet, and they work for 2 years at a time. We also have at the moment 2 young city poets. And they are very much civic roles. So they're kind of, it's sort of poetry is sort of given the sort of the role almost to be a sort of zeitgeisty sort of aspect of what the city is thinking and feeling, which I'm hopeful is something that is happening at least across the UK a little bit more. But again, I think it's interesting that it's sort of flourishing despite despite best efforts.
Sure. Yeah.
But maybe that's the point. That's the point of poets. You know, you do it despite.
Always. It's a tenacious medium. Yeah.
we're starting to run out of time, which is, we haven't delved into the poems. And I must say to people watching this, we could have, well, I could have bored you all with all my feelings about each and every poem, but I urge you to go and read them so you can, you can have your thoughts yourself about it. I suppose, the classic question is, what are you working on now? While you were touring and talking about customs, were you already thinking about the next thing you were going to write?
I'm always thinking about the next thing I'm going to write, and it never ends up being the thing that I'm thinking about, or no. And I think, yeah, I haven't quite ever worked out that sense of, what is an entire book, and then what is actually just a dependent clause in a single sentence in a in an afterword or something of thought. But the poetry is kind of private, and I think will stay a little private for some time. Right now, I am working on 2 essays. One is a preface or a forward. I can't remember which, and I should, to Evan Boland's forthcoming selected essays, which is I'm really excited about, and another is an essay on June Jordan and her work. And these are 2 like central figures to my writing life in their own ways. And so right now, as we're talking, I'm very much steeped in this sense of female predecessors and various ways that they have carved, forward, and more privately, what is my way in relation to that, because it is neither of theirs directly, but is certainly in conversation with that. So I find myself and most of my work conversing at the moment with other poets and figures that I'm thinking about, and hopefully it will become that statement of poetics that I've been working on for many years. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to getting my hands on anything else that you write. So I think
Thanks so much, though.
I'll be writing to Bloomsbury to make sure that they publish more of your wonderful work. So Customs, available in all your favorite bookshops. And yes, as I've said, I urge you to pick up a copy. It's a collection I think that I will read and read again. And to be honest, and I already know who I'm going to give it to. So that's exciting. Thank you so much for your time today and for reading one of your poems. We really appreciate it. And I hope one day you will visit the UK and we can meet you in person.
I hope so. Thank you. Thanks so much, Zoe. And, thanks to future you watching this, wherever you are.